The greatest king the elves would ever know, never fought a single war in Middle-earth. His authority was so absolute, his power so utterly transcendent, that he chose to dwell beside the gods themselves. His name was Ingwë, High King of all elves, and his reverence was so profound that even the proud Fëanor and the wise Finwë bowed to him without question. To compare his reign to the kingship of Elrond is to compare the sun to a candle. This is the chronicle of a legacy forgotten, the story of a path not taken, a path of pure communion with the divine, a path that led not to sorrow and exile, but to everlasting light. Our story begins before the first dawn, in the deepest silence of the world. In a time known as the Years of the Trees, the light of the Valar was contained wholly within their hidden realm of Valinor, leaving the vast continent of Middle-earth to slumber under a blanket of eternal starlight. It was a world of profound shadows and piercing silver light, untrodden by man or dwarf, where ancient forests dreamed and the mountains waited for the song that would shape them. And there, by the shores of a lake named Quivien, the water of awakening, the plan of Ilúvatar, the One, came to its first great fruition. The elves, the firstborn, awoke. They had no memory, no history, only the immediacy of existence. Their first sight was not the sun, nor the moon, but the cold and ancient light of the firmament. Varda, queen of the stars, had sown the heavens with new silver fires in anticipation of their arrival, and it was this light they loved above all else. They rose from the earth as if from a long sleep, and their minds were filled with questions. They began to give names to all that they saw, and in this act of naming, they began to shape the world with the first notes of language. They were innocent, yet possessed of a wisdom that preceded knowledge. They were divided, even then, into three distinct kindreds, though they did not yet know it. There were the Minyar, the first clan, with hair of shining gold. There were the Tatyar, the second clan, with hair as dark as the shadows of twilight. And there were the Nelyar, the third and largest clan, whose love for the sound of water would define their fate. Among the Minyar, the golden-haired, was one named Ingwë. He was not yet a king, but a quiet sense of authority rested upon him. Where others were filled with a joyous and simple wonder, Ingwë was filled with a deep and searching awe. His spirit seemed to yearn for the source of the light he so loved, a light far greater than even the stars of Varda. This idyllic age of innocence, however, was lived under a shadow they could not yet perceive. Melkor, the great enemy, the first Dark Lord, still roamed the wilds of Middle-earth. His fortresses of Utumno and Angband lay far to the north, but his spies and evil spirits wandered the dark lands, and they were the first to discover the awakening. A terror began to creep into the starlit world. Elves who strayed too far from their kin would vanish, and a great fear fell upon them. It was whispered that a dark rider would come for the unwary, a nameless horror that bred a deep distrust of all strangers. These were the first wounds inflicted upon the world, the first seeds of evil sown by Melkor, twisting the fair forms of captured elves into the first grotesque orcs. But the elves did not know their enemy. So when a true rider of the Valar finally appeared, his coming was met not with joy, but with terror. His name was Orm, the great hunter of the Valar. He came upon the elves by chance, while hunting the monsters of Melkor in the east of Middle-earth. The sound of his horn echoed through the hills, and the earth shook beneath the hooves of his great steed, Nahar. The elves, remembering the dark whispers, fled from him. They saw his divine light, and, in their fear, mistook it for a terrible new threat. But Orm was wise. He reined in his mighty horse, and looked upon them, and he knew at once that these were the children of the stars, whose coming had been foretold. He stayed among them for a time, dispelling their fears with his gentle power. And in him, the elves saw for the first time a being of a higher order, a lord from the west whose majesty was beyond their comprehension. But how does a people with no concept of gods react when a god walks among them? Orm, Sok's arrival was a revelation that shattered their understanding of the world. It confirmed there was a greater power, a source of the light, and a danger far more ancient than they had ever imagined. Orm returned with all speed to Valinor, and brought the news to the other Valar. A great debate was held. Some, led by the Vala Ulmo, Lord of Waters, argued that the elves should be left to wander free in Middle-earth, to shape the lands and heal its hurts according to their own will. But most, led by the king, Manwë, feared for the safety of the firstborn. They knew the malice of Melkor was a poison that would eventually corrupt and destroy all that was fair. So a fateful decision was made. The Valar would go to war against Melkor, break his fortresses, and invite the elves to leave the starlit darkness of Middle-earth and dwell with them in the blessed light of Valinor. The war that followed was devastating, reshaping the very geography of the continent. But in the end, the Valar were victorious. They broke the gates of Utumno and dragged Melkor back to Valinor in chains, to be imprisoned for 3 long ages. With the world cleansed, for a time, of its greatest evil, Orchrome was sent back to Cuivién. He came now with a summons, an invitation to paradise. But the elves were hesitant. The war had been terrible, and many feared the sheer, cataclysmic power of the Valar as much as they feared the dark. They were a people of the starlight, and the thought of abandoning their birthplace for a land they had never seen was daunting. So, a compromise was reached. Orchrome would take 3 ambassadors from among the elves, one from each of the great clans, to Valinor. They would see the light of the 2 trees for themselves and return to bear witness to its glory, so their people could make an informed choice. From the first clan, the Minyar, they chose Ingwë. From the second clan, the Tatyar, they chose Finwë, who would become father of the legendary Feanor. And from the third clan, the Nelyar, they chose Elwë, who would one day be known as King Thingol of Doriath. These 3 were the first of all the elves to set foot on the path that would lead out of Middle-earth. They followed Orchrome on his great steed, Nahar, journeying for many long weeks across the vast, untamed continent. They saw the remnants of the Great War, the broken mountains, and the new seas that had been formed. Finally, they came to the westernmost shores of the world, to the great sea that lay between them and the Undying Lands. And there, a ship was waiting, sent by Ulmo, the Lord of Waters. They crossed the impassable ocean, a journey no mortal would ever complete, and at last they saw it. A light began to grow upon the horizon, a light unlike anything they had ever known. It was not the cold, distant silver of the stars, but a living, breathing radiance that was both gentle and overwhelmingly powerful. They had come to Aman, the Undying Lands. They were brought before the thrones of the Valar, and they stood in the Ring of Doom, listening to the counsel of the gods. But it was not the majesty of the Valar that captured their souls. It was the sight of the 2 trees, Telperion the silver and Lorelin the gold. Their light washed over the land, in alternating tides of silver dew and golden rain. It was the source of all beauty, the physical manifestation of divine song. Ingwë, Finwë, and Elwë saw a light that would change them forever. But what they could not know was that this same light would one day tear their people apart. For Ingwë, it was the fulfillment of a yearning he had felt since his first moments of consciousness. The stars he had loved were but a faint echo of this true, perfect light. His spirit was utterly and completely overwhelmed with love and reverence. He desired nothing more than to remain in this land, to dwell forever at the feet of the Valar, and bask in the glory of the trees. Finwë too was moved, but in him the light sparked something different. It kindled a desire for knowledge, for craft, for the making of things that could capture even a fraction of this beauty. He saw the light not just as a thing to be revered, but as an inspiration for creation. Elwë was also filled with awe, but his heart was still tied to the starlit forests of his home. The light was magnificent, but the call of Middle-earth, the land of his awakening, remained strong within him. In these 3 reactions, the destinies of the 3 great elven houses were sealed: the Vanyar, the Noldor, and the Teleri. The lovers of light, the lovers of craft, and the lovers of the sea and stars. Their time in Valinor came to an end. Orchrome brought them back across the sea, back to the familiar darkness of Middle-earth. But they were not the same elves who had left. When Ingwë stood before his people, they fell silent. He did not need to speak of what he had seen. They could see it in his eyes. They could feel the memory of that divine light radiating from his very being. He was no longer merely Ingwë of the Minyar. He was transfigured, an emissary of a divine truth. His quiet authority was now an undeniable majesty. He spoke of Valinor not as a distant land, but as their true and destined home. He spoke of the Valar not as fearsome powers, but as benevolent guardians. And he spoke of the light as the ultimate desire of every elven heart. His words, filled with an unshakable conviction born of direct experience, moved the hearts of almost all who heard him. And so began the great journey, the sundering of the elves. Those who heeded the call and chose to follow their leaders to the west were forever after known as the Eldar, the people of the stars. But not all were convinced. Some loved the starlight of Middle-earth too much to leave it. They distrusted the Valar, or simply feared the long and perilous road. These elves, who remained behind, were called the Avari, the unwilling. They would fade into the deep forests of the world, their fate diverging forever from that of their kin. Ingwë led the first and smallest host, his own clan, the Minyar. Because they were the first to set out and followed the light with the most unwavering zeal, they would later be renamed the Vanyar, the Fair Elves. Finwë followed with his much larger host, the Noldor, the Deep Elves, eager for the knowledge and craft of Valinor. And last came the largest host of all, the Teleri, led by Elwë and his brother Olwë, who moved more slowly, for they were hesitant to leave the twilight lands they loved. The journey was long and fraught with peril. Middle-earth was still a wild place, and the servants of Melkor, though their master was captive, still lingered in dark places. The hosts of the Vanyar and the Noldor, driven by the compelling testimony of Ingwë and Finwë, moved with purpose, crossing the misty mountains and pushing ever westward through the vast lands of Eriador. But the Teleri, the hindmost host, tarried. Their love for the wide lands, for the rivers and the forests, made them reluctant to press on. And it was during this delay that fate intervened. Elwë, lord of the Teleri, wandered alone into the great forest of Nan Elmoth. There, he heard the singing of a voice so beautiful it arrested his heart. He followed the sound, and in a glade he came upon Melian, one of the Maiar, a divine spirit of the same order as Sauron or Gandalf, who had dwelt in Middle-earth out of love for its deep shadows and starlit glades. When Elwë looked upon her, he fell into a deep enchantment. He took her hand, and a spell was laid upon him. And for many long years they stood together in the forest, silent, as the stars wheeled overhead and the seasons passed them by. His people searched for him in vain. Elwë, their king, was lost. The loss of their leader threw the Teleri into disarray. Some refused to leave, continuing the search for their king for years. Others, led by Elwë, as brother Olwë, eventually pressed on, urged by the summons of the Valar. This was the second sundering of the elves. The Teleri were now split into those who continued west, and those who stayed behind, who would become known as the Sindar, the Grey Elves of Beleriand. But why did an entire nation, the Vanyar, abandon a continent and choose a life of seclusion with such conviction? The answer lies not in fear, but in a revelation so profound it dwarfed all earthly ambition. For Ingwë and his people, the light of the two trees was not a prize to be won or a tool to be used. It was the end of all quests. When the Vanyar and the Noldor finally reached the western shores, Ulmo uprooted an entire island, Tol Eressëa, and used it as a colossal ferry to carry them across the sea to the Blessed Realm. They had completed the journey. They passed through the enchanted seas, and finally set foot in Aman, the land of the gods. They were brought to the green hill of Tuna, which stood in a pass in the mountains of the Pelori, and there they could gaze upon the light of the trees. The Vanyar and the Noldor built a great city together upon the hill, the beautiful Tirion. For a time they dwelt in harmony, learning great lore from the Valar and the Maiar. But the hearts of the two kindreds were different. Finwë and the Noldor were enamored with the world, and they filled their city with works of great craft and beauty. But Ingwë and the Vanyar were changed. Their love was for the light itself, and for the Valar who had brought them to it. The city of Tirion, the lands of Eldamar, even the companionship of their Noldoran cousins, became secondary. Their spirits yearned for something even closer to the source. Ingwë led his people from Tirion. He abandoned the city they had helped build, and journeyed inward, to the very feet of Taniquetil, the holy mountain where Manwë and Varda held their thrones. There they dwelt, in the full, unshielded radiance of the two trees, breathing the air of the gods, and listening to their song. They forsook all other lands. Middle-earth became a distant memory, a starlit dream from their infancy. Their devotion was absolute. Ingwë was granted the title of High King of all Elves, a title recognized even by the proud Noldor who remained in Tirion, for his wisdom and his proximity to the Valar placed him beyond any rivalry. He became the voice of the elves in the councils of the gods. He had achieved the ultimate end of his people's journey. But this perfect communion came at a cost. They had chosen paradise, but in doing so, they had chosen oblivion. They would play almost no further part in the great tales and tragedies of Middle-earth. They were safe, but they were separate. While Ingwë and the Vanyar dwelt in this perfect bliss, the seeds of the greatest tragedy in the history of Arda were being sown just down the mountain, in the city of Tirion. The Noldor, led by Finwë, grew ever more skilled, and their greatest craftsman was Finwë's own son, Fëanor. Fired by an inner flame of creativity and genius, Fëanor conceived of his greatest work, a way to capture the light of the two trees themselves. He labored for years, using knowledge and materials unknown to any other being, and at last he brought them forth. 3 jewels, the Silmarils. Within them, Feanor had ensnared the blended light of Lorelin and Telperion. They were the most beautiful and prized objects ever created, hallowed by Varda herself, so that no mortal flesh or unclean hand could touch them. All of Valinor marveled at their creation. Even the Valar were astounded, but their beauty was a perilous one. And in the north, the 3 ages of Melkor's imprisonment were coming to an end. The Valar, in their mercy, believed his repentance was true. Melkor was paroled, allowed to walk freely in the blessed land of Valinor, but his heart was a pit of malice, and he looked upon the light of the trees and the happiness of the elves with a hatred that had festered for 3 ages in the dark. He sowed lies among the Noldor, whose thirst for knowledge and creation he twisted into pride and jealousy. He whispered that the Valar had brought them to Akraman only to cage them, to keep them from the wide realms of Middle-earth, where they could be kings. He fanned the flames of Feanor's pride, turning his love for the Silmarils into a possessive, paranoid fire. Strife grew between the princes of the Noldor. Feanor, believing his half-brothers sought to usurp his place and steal his treasures, threatened them with violence in the very courtyards of the king. For this, the Valar exiled him from Tirion, and Melkor, his work of discord done, vanished into the shadows. He had found a new ally in the darkness to the south, Ungoliant, a primeval spirit of hunger who had taken the form of a monstrous spider. He promised to sate her endless appetite, and together they crept back to the heart of Valinor during a time of high festival. While the Valar and Elves celebrated, Melkor struck. He pierced the 2 trees of Valinor, and Ungoliant drank their light and poisoned their roots. She swelled to a monstrous size, and the light of the world was extinguished, replaced by an unlight, a darkness that was not mere absence of light, but a tangible, smothering presence. In that suffocating gloom, Yavanna lamented that she could heal the trees, but only if she could reclaim the light locked within the Silmarils. But Feanor, his heart now clenched in a fist of pride and grief, refused. It was then that messengers arrived from his fortress, bearing the worst of all tidings. Melkor had not acted alone. He had stormed Feanor's stronghold, slain his father, Finwë, the High King of the Noldor, and stolen the Silmarils. He had fled Valinor, crossed the northern ice, and returned to his ancient fortress of Angband in Middle-earth. He was Morgoth now, the black foe of the world. Maddened by grief and rage, Feanor cursed Morgoth, and he cursed the Valar for their failure to protect his people. He then swore an oath, a terrible and unbreakable vow, and made his 7 sons swear it with him. By the name of the Creator, Ilúvatar, they vowed to pursue with vengeance and hatred to the ends of the world any being, Vala, demon, elf, or man, who should take or keep a Silmaril from them. This oath would shadow all the ages to come, bringing with it endless war, betrayal, and sorrow. Feanor incited the Noldor to abandon the now darkened land of the gods and follow him back to Middle-earth to wage war on Morgoth and reclaim the jewels. They forsook the counsel of the Valar and chose the path of exile. When the Teleri, their kin, refused to give them their white ships for their unsanctioned war, Feanor ordered an attack. Elf slew elf for the first time in the world's history. The waters of the Haven of the Swans ran red with the blood of kin, a stain that would never be washed away. As they sailed north, a curse was laid upon them. The prophecy of the north, the doom of the Noldor. They were told that their quest was born of wrath and would end in sorrow, that they would be betrayed and afflicted by treason, and that their oath would turn on them and destroy them. The light of Aman was shut against them. They had left paradise to reclaim the light, but brought with them only darkness. They sought to be lords of the free, but became slaves to their own oath. The greatest tragedy of the elves had begun. The wars for the Silmarils, the fall of great kingdoms, the tales of heroes, and the despair of a broken world, all stemmed from this moment, from the light of creation ensnared, and the darkness that rose to claim it. The age of the trees was over. The first age of the sun was about to begin, and the great tales of Middle-earth were now truly set in motion. To witness the wars, the betrayals, and the heartbreaking heroism that follows the Noldor back to Middle-earth, and to see how this ancient tragedy shapes all that is to come, subscribe to the _Silmarillion_Chronicles. The legend has just begun.